Dallas, I don't feel too well.
Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 11 of Dictate, Dissect, and Discuss with me, Fina. In today's episode, we are going to be covering the first part of Oliver Boyd-Barrett's Judith Miller, the New York Times, and the Propaganda Model. Abstract 1. An assessment of Herman and Chomsky's 1988 5-filter propaganda model suggests it is mainly valuable for identifying areas in which researchers should look for evidence of collaboration, whether intentional or otherwise, between mainstream media and the propaganda aims of the ruling establishment. This paper extends the model to include the buying out of journalists or their publications by intelligence and related special interest organizations. It applies the extended 6-filter model to controversies over reporting by the New York Times of the buildup towards the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, the issue of weapons of mass destruction in general, and the reporting of the New York Times correspondent Judith Miller in particular, in the context of broader critiques of U.S. mainstream media war coverage. The controversies helped elicit evidence of the operation of some filters of the propaganda model, including dependence on official sources, fear of flak, and ideological convergence. The paper finds that the filter of routine news operations needs to be counterbalanced by its opposite, namely non-routine abuses of standard operating procedures. The Iraq War of 2003 helped establish how the media manufactures our consent by being bought out by the government and the subsequent Republican national interest when it comes to war and news media. When the media are embedded, afraid of reproach, reliant on heavily biased sources of imperial power, and getting paid lots of money by their patriotic, nationalist war hawk benefactors, then of course they'll bend the knee and loosen their integrity to do what's asked of them. Judith Miller is the case for discussion today, and through our analysis of this paper, we'll see how she and the New York Times essentially acted as the propaganda mouthpiece for American hegemony and absolution for George W. Bush in the post-9/11 period. Two, the first filter comprises the large size, corporate ownership, and profit orientation of media. Mainstream media have become increasingly profit-oriented. Their goal is to maximize audience numbers, especially of those audiences in which advertisers, those interests constitute the second filter, are most interested. Thirdly, media depend heavily on official sources. Fourthly, media fear flak, the criticism and punishment that powerful news sources inflict on media and journalists who do not report according to the script these sources prefer. Finally, the media share the same broad ideological outlook as their government. Herman and Chomsky referred to this ideological agreement principally in the context of anti-communism. These are the 5 filters through which the propaganda model manifests. When we see a journal, we see only the writers and their work, not the giant media conglomerates behind them, which are constantly funneling sources of intelligence, money, and bias down the tube. The goal is to align themselves with the narrative that will get them airtime as well as subscriptions, and alienating a huge viewer base with talk of Abu Ghraib and chemical attacks by US soldiers is not ideal. Advertisers will immediately pull out. If your sources consist of only the official word from the Department of Defense, then you're left with only one side of the story, a story that might be getting doctored for public consumption. If a reporter says something off color, then they're liable to receive word from up high that they need to ameliorate their statement, add new evidence, or retract their claims entirely lest they be canned or demoted. The media also will not take kindly to somebody sharing something that doesn't slip inside the Overton window of acceptable discourse. That's why anything outside the Democrat-Republican lens of political discourse gets looked at as too much. Three. One area that Herman and Chomsky seem purposely to eschew was the direct purchase of media influenced by powerful sources or the buying out of individual journalists or their media by government agencies and authorities. Journalistic collaboration with the CIA ranged from intelligence gathering to serving as the go-betweens with spies. Nearly every major U.S. news organization had been penetrated, usually with the cooperation of top management. CIA-penetrated media included Associated Press, ABC, CBS, Hearst Newspapers, Miami Herald, Mutual Broadcasting Systems, NBC, New York Herald Tribune, The New York Times, Newsweek, Reuters, Saturday Evening Post, Scripps Howard, Time Life, and United Press International. To buy something out means to unseat the integrity from something by changing its ownership. This usually entails an overhaul or a shift in ideological contents under the overt or covert new owners. If a journalist is on the take by, say, some conservative think tank, then they report favorably on conservative policies so they can eat at night. It's just survival of the fittest in a sense. When an organization has been claimed by the CIA, for example, there will be a lack of incentive to report on war crimes, astroturfing, espionage, etc. by the embedded reporters on scene. Four. A CIA memo quoted by Cockburn and St. Clair explained that the agency maintains, quote, relationships with reporters from every major wire service, newspaper, news weekly, and TV network, end quote, and that in many instances, quote, we have persuaded reporters to postpone, change, hold, or even scrap stories that could have adversely affected national security interest or jeopardized sources or methods, end quote. This was confirmed by The Guardian newspaper in 1991, whose correspondent Richard Norton Taylor disclosed that some 500 prominent Britons were paid by the CIA through the corrupt, now defunct, Bank of Commerce and Credit International, including 90 journalists, many in senior positions. This statement provides further evidence that wartime news broadcasting is often doctored before we even see the tape. It makes it very hard for the average person to have faith in media during wartime at all. Even media watchdog groups can't report on the flaws and biases of these TV networks, newspapers, and radio shows. It's just too big to critique on a comprehensive level. The CIA is even paying other countries' reporters not to spill stories in their own countries that would lead to negative media portrayal of U.S. involvement in foreign affairs. Now that is some major damage control and obsession with image, if I do say so myself. Five. Following the mid-1970s, many propaganda functions were transferred by the CIA and Congress to privately funded organizations, through conduits such as the Ford Foundation and similar bodies. Examples include the Asia Foundation, Congress for Cultural Freedom, and the National Endowment for Democracy. In more recent times, as in the build-up to the war in Iraq, we have seen the circumvention of official practices of misinformation by the creation of new units, such as the Pentagon's Office of Special Plans. I think it's interesting how average citizens, though, side note, we should not assume they are in any way like average Joe down the road. They hold much more influence. Don't work in Congress or in the CIA can now manufacture as much open propaganda as they want, as long as it's within acceptable millionaire oil magnate or hedge fund discourse. That's an awful lot of power to give some Wharton graduate, but hey, smart move by the US government. They can just scapegoat the Koch brothers of the world and say, well, these guys don't speak for us. But more to the point, if the organization is semi-affiliated with Congress or another arm of the cabinet, then they have the benefit of being able to come in at any time and receive the information and know what's up, while simultaneously leaving the heavy lifting and propaganda to the secondary organization. The affiliate organization also takes the heat when a diplomatic or domestic slip-up happens. Six. However, buying out suggests the exercise of direct but covert control of news media, not simply as cover for intelligence activity, but for the purpose of state manipulation of public opinion and propaganda, a degree of fusion between state and news media practices that goes beyond the dynamics of everyday political economy. Self-explanatory. Buying out doesn't mean you completely renovate an existing journal or TV station or radio station or what have you from the inside out. It means that whoever is now the master in this scenario is the last word on whatever gets said or printed. Through this dynamic, they can manipulate the flow, type, and delivery of the information and excise information deemed harmful or frame it in a less harmful way. Seven. Commenting on U.S. television coverage of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, the then Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke, criticized their, quote, unquestioning, shocking, and gung-ho coverage, end quote. He said America had, quote, no news operation strong enough or brave enough to stand up against the White House and Pentagon, and that since 9/11, many American networks had, quote, wrapped themselves in the American flag and swapped impartiality for patriotism, end quote. He further noted how one media group, Clear Channel, was using its airwaves to organize pro-war rallies. Harper Magazine's John MacArthur said of media coverage of the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad that the network swallowed whole, quote, absolutely a photo op created for Bush's re-election campaign commercials, end quote. What many modern-day reporters, embedded ones especially, must realize is that the goal of presenting information in a news format is not to be so involved with the cause that you essentially just repeat the talking points of those who are already deeply invested into one side of it or another. When a reporter embeds, they start to see the war through the eyes of a soldier instead of a reporter. If I was a reporter on the front lines of Iraq, I would be scared to report on soldiers beating up children and elderly citizens for fear that those soldiers would beat me up. See the problem? And it comes at a higher level too. Your story would get axed straight out because your work would be seen as harming public opinion and morale during wartime, as well as potentially being a security liability. Photojournalists end up taking pictures for front page sensational stories that all but secure re-election for those men and women who benefit from war casualties, leaving the average person outraged and enthusiastic at the same time over death and victory. What a roller coaster. 8. During the 1991 Gulf War, CNN had allowed Pentagon trainees into the CNN newsroom in Atlanta. Prior to the 2003 war in Iraq, CNN news head Eason Jordan asked the Pentagon, in effect, to vet and approve ex-military men that CNN hoped to use as analysts, the equivalent, noted Howard Rosenberg, of the Los Angeles Times, of consulting with the White House in advance about political or policy experts it planned to use on the air. CNN chairman Walter Isaacson had instructed his international correspondents in Afghanistan, 2001, to downplay stories of death and destruction caused by American bombings, for fear that this would undermine popular support for the U.S. military effort. To ensure that every CNN report always included a justification of the war, Davis prescribed specific language for anchors to read after each account of civilian casualties. CNN's top war correspondent, Christine Amanpour, said in September 2003 that, quote, "The press was muzzled, and I think the press self-muzzled. I'm sorry to say, but certain television and, perhaps to a certain extent, my station was intimidated by the administration and its foot soldiers at Fox News, and it did, in fact, put a climate of fear and self-censorship, in my view, in terms of the kind of broadcast work we did." These examples indicate what is at the time an astonishing and deliberate degree of collaboration by media with the propaganda objectives of the administration, enough that would lead some people to suspect that an element of buying out was at work, although alternative explanations, like excessive patriotic zeal or the controlled trade-off between support and access to information, are available. The main takeaway here is this. Reporters should not be so heavily involved in defensive affairs that they might as well strap a gun on and go to war themselves. They should not be spoon-fed information. Journalists of all stripes need to, do some investigating on their own without a state apparatus holding their hand and guiding them to the conclusion. Without popular support, an administration is fighting a selfish war, not a war for the people, war for justice, war for democracy, etc. Fox News, CNN, the New York Times, and others essentially act as the go-between for the average citizen and the military. If our reporters are in fear of censorship and what they'll be able to print, then what we're getting is the equivalent of some West Point graduates yelling about freedom in our ears for half an hour every day. There is no filtration. Between the choice of buying out and having a job, albeit with many restrictions, versus having no job, whilst the propaganda machine works anyway, is a tough choice, but an obvious one. Nine. By late January 2003, it was increasingly clear to most commentators that the Bush administration had lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in order to justify the March invasion. A Washington Post story dissected the story of Judith Miller of the New York Times, arguing that Miller had acted as conduit for stories originating in U.S. military and intelligence agencies. She had cultivated a relationship with Ahmed Chalabi, a convicted embezzler and head of the Iraqi National Congress, INC, a U.S. finance exile group with close ties to the Pentagon civilian leadership. Miller functioned as liaison between the U.S. military and the INC. Chalabi had provided her with misleading information that was the basis of many front-page New York Times stories concerning WMDs. Finally, we come to Judith Miller. Miller herself was the most famous of the inaccurate reporting that came out of this period in American history. She is, in a way, culpable by proxy for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. At the very least, she is responsible for selling and making palatable the invasion of Iraq and the subsequent crimes committed there, as well as the deaths of the Iraqi and American participants in the war, to the American public. She lied about the WMDs, had a working relationship with an Iraq exile affiliated with the Pentagon, and acted as a cheerleader for imperialism with her misinformation campaign. I'm not surprised she later went on to work for Fox News. (10) Writing for editor and publisher, William Jackson mused whether Miller had once again been chosen to leak questionable material for a special interest within government, and whether Miller had previously secured a, quote, very unusual clearance for a journalist, granted by some Pentagon authority, end quote. Ban concludes that the New York Times, along with all other major American media, is, quote, implicated in the business of fronting for intelligence agencies, the military, the White House, and other segments of the state apparatus, end quote. Another self-explanatory point. It's never good to hear that your one source of international coverage is a front for the intelligence community. We accuse other countries of the same bias reporting in their news media, but when it comes to our own, it's no problem. 11. Massing also critiqued New York Times coverage and press coverage in general. He noted that in the period before the war, quote, U.S. journalists were far too reliant on sources sympathetic to the administration. Those with dissenting views, and there were more than a few, were shut out. Reflecting this, the coverage was highly deferential to the White House, end quote. Those with dissenting views included many top nuclear, intelligence, and other experts, both inside and outside of the administration and government agencies, whose views were sometimes iced out, marginalized, and buried deep. Even before the war machine chugs to life to accept more sacrifices, we see a concentrated effort to prepare the stage by sowing seeds of mistrust, fear, doubt, and anxiety among the public by manufacturing information. Normalizing a culture of silence where dissent is punishable via firing someone is an institutionalized bullying tactic. When we ignore those who are insiders literally telling us that we're hearing and seeing the wrong info, we're telling those people that their words are, at best, not worth listening to, and at most treasonous. What would it have been like if we had listened to insiders, security analysts, nuclear engineers, and more, who said that reporting on fake weapons of mass destruction would blow up, literally, in our faces? It's not right to defer to the White House when even an idiot would know that they need the war to continue at all costs. Moreover, by broadcasting loud and clear the message embedded by the Pentagon, it makes it seem like all Americans, or their news media, are naturally hostile towards Iraqis, in this example, which would breed more hatred and resentment for us on the world stage and lead to many more complications in the future for foreign policy. Nobody likes getting dragged through the mud. I guess YOLO journalism has lasted from the destruction of the USS Maine to now. Nothing really changes, does it? And finally, for this video, 12. On May 26, 2004, nearly 1 year after the industry publication, editor and publisher, had called on the New York Times to reassess Miller's work, and 3 months after the Massing critique, the New York Times ran a piece under the byline "From the Editors," and actually written by executive editor Bill Keller, apologizing for aspects of New York Times coverage. The apology acknowledged that the New York Times had run stories that depended at least in part on information from a circle of Iraqi informants, defectors, and exiles whose credibility later proved highly suspect. Among these names, that of Ahmad Chalabi, leader of the US-supported INC, was singled out. Damage control at its finest, ladies and gentlemen. It's too late to apologize, and by this point, it doesn't matter if the Times pointed out how bad their sources were. People are dead and the war is in full swing. Who knew that taking the word of people hostile to the Iraqi government, who clearly want to see the country get its just desserts, would lead to bad outcomes? That's it for this part, everyone. Please tune in next time to episode 12, where we will finish Oliver Boyd-Barrett's Judith Miller, the New York Times, and the Propaganda Machine. I look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, goodbye!
Eight, 2, 7, 5. Honey.